Hi everyone, and welcome back to Advancing with Watercolor. I'm Gary Tucker. This week I'm still in Venice and I'm painting the painting that you see behind me. The challenge was to paint reflections on water. I realized that when I was in Venice this past September, it was a bit of a challenge. So I decided to undertake the project of learning how to paint reflections on water. If you follow along with me, you'll discover some of the things that I found in doing this exercise. You can also find a PDF in the description below this video, which shares more information on painting water and reflections specific to watercolor technique. You can also find a list of the materials that I use. So join me and let's paint reflections on a Venetian canal. Hi everyone. Well, I'm returning to a painting that was giving me some problems in Venice. Not sure exactly why. I feel that I paint some things well and some things not as well as I would like. I think this is true for a lot of people. I'm using this video to challenge on water and reflections on water. So this painting has gone through several iterations, all in an attempt to find a better way to portray water. I think this is common with a lot of artists, that you develop strengths strengths with certain motifs, and at the same time you develop not weaknesses, but certainly other parts of your repertoire are not as strong, and water is that way for me. So I want to gain a strength with painting water and reflections and different types of water. So I'm going to be doing more of this on the YouTube channel, showing you how to paint reflections. One of the important aspects of painting strong reflections that I found is creating a graded wash, and you see me doing that now. The graded wash is going to be accomplished by starting with this yellow ochre and developing it into a deeper, richer green using cobalt turquoise. You see I'm using a very large brush, and you can see a reference to that in the description below. Using the large brush and a lot of pigment, a lot of water, helps me to get a very smooth transition. Sometimes I'll turn the painting upside down and gravity will pull the color a little higher in the wash, and then I'll rewrite the painting and develop it to the bottom of the painting. This sort of back and forth allows me to get a strong graded wash, and this graded wash really sets the stage for creating reflections. That's what I've found in doing this particular painting. One of the things that also helped me was trying to understand what I'm looking at. I can appreciate it from a visual sense and understand it visually, but I wanted to know a little bit more about the physics too, or the properties of what I was seeing from a rational standpoint. And I found that there's several components to reflections on water. One of them is reflecting what's above the water, and part of what we're doing with that graded wash is starting to account for the bright building that's behind. A second component is creating the surface of the water. Is it smooth? Is it choppy? Is it very rough? The sorts of strokes that we're seeing, that we see, the sort of waves that we see are depicted by strokes. You can see me starting to build that up on the right-hand side, where I'm reflecting the shadow of a building and the bridge at the same time. And in addition to that, I'm trying to let some of the original green come through in the form of waves. So I found that there's several things that I want to account for when building up reflections, And I want to do it in a fashion that still looks painterly, that doesn't feel too photographic, that feels exuberant, that feels expressive. And so I'm really thoughtful about how I'm using the brush when I paint the reflections. Well, we need something to reflect, and so you see me building up the upper third of the painting. I did move this area higher in the painting than the photograph or even the scene would indicate. The reason is so I can make my reflections a little more vertical, a little longer than they would appear. I also, since we're talking about edits, I also eliminated a boat that was floating on the right-hand side, a reference to the shore on the right-hand side. These edits were made so that I could really give a large, sort of uninterrupted area for the reflections. So there's a reason for that. What you see me now, I'm painting a shadowed area that's behind several important things. The shadow moves from the left side of the picture in towards the picture, in towards the center, and it allows me to define the back end of the gondola. It allows me to define one of the large, tall poles that exist everywhere in Venice, where a gondolier may anchor a boat, or any sort of craft can be anchored on these pillars. And then the gondolier himself, I'm using this shadow to help shape the back of the gondolier. So that's why I'm spending time with that, so that I can get a nice sharp edge and really define these three things before I move across the paper. And then I started to extend that dark mid-tone across the painting and make an effort to connect windows, poles and wires that are attached to the building, signage, doorways, even figures help me to connect this strong mid-tone from the left side all the way to the right side. And as we talked about in last week's lesson, connecting the dark mid-tone, or connecting the mid-tone through the painting, is really a helpful working thought, because it just builds a certain integration into the painting, and your darks are not scattered throughout the painting. I'm attacking a difficult shape right now, which is the gondola itself. And I'm using a strong color, some of the ultramarine blue, along with neutral tint or black. And this is going to be the strongest dark in the painting. And look at how this is connecting the darks through the painting. It's a dark shape in itself, and it's helping me to span the areas between the shadow on the right and the shadow on the left. So a lot of the placement of these things was contemplated and put in place to hold the painting together. And this is something that I spend time with before even putting brush to paper. I want to have those things sort of in place. And as you saw with last week's or the previous 2 weeks' work, I do that very often through tonal studies, something that I can do rather quickly, and these also give room for adjustment. Adjustments are easier when you're doing a tonal study. And I'll show you my tonal study in the last part of this last part of this video. You can see it towards the end. I compare it with the finished version. Also, I recommend that you take a look at the description that's under this video, so that you can see not only the colors that I'm using, but you can also see a link to a PDF which elaborates on some of the things that I'm talking about. Very often when I'm doing the narration, I forget certain things that I wanted to say. And so this PDF often has that information, and I think it's useful to accompany the video. Yeah, we're working in small areas. You see how my hand is down on the brush, resting my palm on the paper, trying to get some really sharp marks so that I can see my gondolier clearly. And now I'm going for the reflections, and I'm trying to be calligraphic in the brushwork. I'm using a rather large Sabelette brush, which I favor for this because it has a nice tip. It allows me to create these S-shaped strokes, either by going on the heel of the brush or through the tip of the brush, and I can get an expressive stroke by doing this. One observation that I made that I'm trying to account for is as the reflections come off the far shore, the breaks in the reflection, the lighter areas that kind of cut through the reflection are much more narrow. As they come closer to the viewer or myself, they get broader, they get thicker, and they get more fragmented. So I'm trying to account for this as I bring the reflections lower in the painting. Another thing that is helpful to know about reflections is they're kind of guided by the viewer. So they tend to follow the viewer, in fact. They almost always appear straight down towards the viewer. They're not like shadows, which are determined by the angle of the sun or the angle of the light. They're very much determined by where you're standing. So in one sense, that makes it a little easier to paint because they're almost always coming straight down. You can see now I'm leaving very narrow spaces up on top, and each stroke is kind of placed and then sometimes blended, but very often allowed to just remain as it is with no blending. What I will do as the reflection dries is I'll place some darker reflections inside the reflection that's being placed now, such as a stronger dark or even a suggestion of the local color, such as a red or green or whatever else is above the reflection. And these darks that I'm adding now, they're starting to make the bright aspect of the building appear. And I realize I need to make an adjustment to the ground area so that the building will feel a little lighter. That's what I'm doing now. The paint is dried in the gondola and the gondolier, so it makes this job a little easier. I'm just carrying a light warm tone across the floor so that the building feels a little brighter. Also, that white area in the gondola comes forward a little more, and the light feels strong against the bridge. And at this stage, I feel the painting is nearly complete. I can see it taking shape, and what's left is these sorts of adjustments that I just made to the ground, or I want to add some age to this side of the building, so I'm taking some dry brush of that same color and adding what's typical in Venice is you see the plaster falling off, and that's what I'm adding now, just a little bit of color and a little bit of an interesting shape to break up that bright yellow ochre. Also, it makes a benefit of this is it's making that edge of the building a little gentler. It was a very harsh edge to begin with, but now it's a little gentler, and for the painting, for the big picture, that's better because I really want the viewer to fall in love with the reflections and the luminosity that's created in that graded wash, as well as the brightness of the building. Well, the painting is practically finished. In fact, I'm going to break and show you the black and white study that I did prior to this painting, and next to the finished painting of the gondolier on the canal. And I think you can see what I meant by how the graded wash really creates a glowing quality to the light reflected on the water, as well as the power in the brushstrokes and the calligraphic strength that they have. Those were some of the things that I really worked hard at and feel that I've gotten a little more understanding of, so that when I paint water again, I'm going to be able to paint it a little more fluidly and effectively. Thanks for joining me today, everyone. I hope you had a good time painting reflections on water. Before I started this video, it was a bit of a challenge to me, and I felt that I learned some things along the way that could be helpful in the future. This is the real benefit of doing these sorts of projects. Have a look at the description below, as there's some interesting information included in the PDF file. Also, there's a playlist that you'll see at the end of this video that links similar videos to the subject that we are talking about today. Be sure to leave me any comments, and I hope you'll like this video and share it with your friends. Next week I'll be painting the Compo San Margarita in Venice, only I'll be painting shadows and figures, so I hope you'll join me then for another episode of Advancing with Watercolor. Remember to have a look at the description below for a tutorial that accompanies this video, and watch to the end so that you can see a link to a playlist, a link to my website, and a chance to subscribe. Thank you very much for joining me.